Welcome, everybody. My name is Pam Rutledge, and I'm faculty of media psychology at Fielding Graduate University, and I'd really like to thank you for showing up today. I'm very pleased to introduce the following panel that's presenting a narrative approach to professional development in a virtual world. And I think that one of the challenges of the pandemic for everyone has been the loss of connection. And for professionals in particular, contact has been very goal directed. You know, we're having classes and department meetings and Zoom meetings, and it's all very scheduled and organized. So these panelists are going to describe their experience creating an online space for connection that allows for reflection among professionals using a series of narrative prompts and personal stories. The panel today is going to be moderated by Dr. Sherry Hamby. Dr. Hamby is the director of the LifePaths Research Center and founder of ResilienceCon. She is also research professor of psychology at the University of the South. Dr. Hamby is joined today by Dr. Clementine Msengi, and Dr. Msengi is a visiting professor within the Department of Educational Leadership for Doctoral Studies at Lamar University. She is also joined by Dr. Victoria Banyard. Dr. Banyard is a professor and associate director, Center of Violence on Violence Against Women and Children. And finally, last but not least, Danielle Littman, who is a doctoral student in the Graduate School of Social Work at the University of Denver. Before I turn it over to Dr. Hamby, let me remind you that there will be a Q&A period following the formal presentation, drawing on any questions posted in the chat window. You can post questions and comments in the chat window at any time during the presentation, and they will be gathered by the panelists. I'd like to also just give a shout out to my PhD students, Scott Garner and Jay Grant, who are providing the behind the scenes backup for today's presentation. And finally, as a reminder, all presentations are being recorded. And now, Dr. Hamby, welcome. I'll turn this over to you.
Thank you, Dr. Rutledge. And we just wanted to say thanks very much to you and to everybody at Fielding for organizing this conference today. We're really happy to have the chance to have this moment of connection, as you said. So when the pandemic shut everything down, I found myself, like many of us, missing some of the more informal and less goal-directed interactions. So there were still meetings, there's plenty of meetings, and so I was still getting my fill of those, but I was not getting I think even calling them informal or less goal-directed, it doesn't really do them justice. And I started to realize like how much I was relying on these sort of moments of in-betweenness as places that were really helping to sustain my work and sustain each other, that they were places where we were sharing the burdens and the joys of this work, and really even places that I kind of felt seen in terms of my commitment to this work that all of us share. And those are the ones that kind of vanished without a trace when we went into these lockdowns and shutdowns and social distancing practices. So I started thinking about how to recreate that, and working with Vicki, who she and I have worked for many years on this issue about how to do a better job about promoting those kinds of professional spaces, those more nurturing and sustaining kinds. And one of the things that I thought of was some of the qualitative work that she and I have been doing for several years. So some years back, we devised an interview, and it involved asking people to tell 7 stories of the key scenes of their life. This was based on prior work. We're certainly standing on the shoulders of many brilliant scholars who came before us. But this turned out to be a really powerful way to get people to talk about things like resilience, and which we're very interested in. And so they would discuss a high point, a turning point, a low point, a positive behavior, a not so positive behavior, a current challenge, and a story of what they were hoping the future might hold for them. And even though those sound like maybe a pretty straightforward or even pedestrian list, they turned out to be, an amazingly powerful way just to really go deep very quickly with people and really see people for who they are in ways that is hard to kind of communicate. And we've done more than 200 interviews with people in this format. And perhaps just as importantly, I've also done dozens and dozens of interviews using different approaches that just never seem to reach the level of depth and meaning that this key scenes approach seemed to make. So when the pandemic came, I thought about how to maybe rely on narrative, which is something we're very interested in, and that might be a way that we could restore some of this lost connection in some of these lost spaces. So we reached out to our colleagues, and we ended up organizing 2 groups with 14 people total, and we met once a week for 8 weeks for, what was supposed to be 90 minutes, but most of the time ended up being more like 2 hours. Although, people just really not wanting that space to end most of the time. The structure of it was really quite simple, and I think also importantly, completely self-contained, so that people didn't have any homework or obligations outside of this space. It was just a space where they could come and have that time together and not make it something else on your to-do list. So we did 1 prompt per week where everyone writes, ideally if it's comfortable for them, with pen and paper, so that it activates those different parts of the brain that we know are different from what happens in your brain when you type on a computer. And then after each person would write for 20 minutes on a prompt, and then each of us would read our story, including me and Vicki, and then everybody would share feedback with each other. In the end, it became not only a substitute for some of the connection that I had been missing, but really, at least speaking for me, it was one of the best professional experiences that I have had in more than 25 years in this field. And I just was really kind of amazed and moved by how much it ended up meaning to me. I realized that there were so many experiences and challenges that we very seldom talk about. And, for people I've known for a long time, so even for Vicki, who she and I have known each other for more than 25 years when we shared an office as postdocs at the University of New Hampshire, I learned things about you, Vicki, that I did not know, that we'd never gotten around to in 25 years of conversation, that you still pulled out as being, like good, important examples of things that you'd experienced in your professional life. And then for people that I did not know prior to the group, such as Danielle and Clementine, I just found myself very quickly feeling very close to them and very connected to them. I thought too that it wasn't just about those individual relationships, but how much we learned about academia and about this whole sort of culture that we're all kind of swimming in. One of the group members used this phrase that I really loved. She called them audible narratives. And I think that one of the powerful parts of the experience for me is that it did give us space to express a lot of things that are very much true about our professional careers that we don't get to talk about, and really making those audible and shared and named. And so I just really, and that's my new favorite phrase. I just love to say that everywhere. So I know that I sound a little bit like a Hallmark card with all of that probably, and that these things are kind of very easy to describe, and that you can just use all this positive language, and that it doesn't really capture the experience. So we thought that the best way to try to share the impact of this experience on our professional development would actually be to share some of the narratives that emerge from these stories. So each of the 4 of us has picked narrative and then from one of these prompts, and we're going to actually read the story that we shared with the group and then offer some comments on it, and then we will have some further discussion of it. I do see questions starting to come in, and there is, as Dr. Rutledge already mentioned, a 30-minute Q&A session at the end, so we'll take all your questions after we've gone through our stories. So first I'm going to turn it over to Vicki Banyard. She responded to the turning point prompt. I'm going to read the prompt in just a moment here. The title of her story is Never Too Old for New Tricks, and she wrote it in response to this prompt. Looking back on your educational and career path, it may be possible to identify certain key moments that stand out as turning points, something that marked an important change in your trajectory. Please identify an event that you now see as a turning point in your professional path. Describe what happened, where and when, who was involved, what you were thinking and feeling. What does this turning point say about you? Would you like to stay on the path set by this turning point or go in a different direction? With that, I will hand it to you, Dr. Banyard.
Thanks, Dr. Hamby. Thanks, Sherry. Thanks, Dr. Rutledge and everyone else. It's great to be part of this today. So I will get started reading some of the narrative. My turning point, oddly enough, didn't begin in an office. It began in the kitchen. So here we are. We were talking while my husband was making dinner. He was debriefing about another dismal faculty meeting complete with announcements about lecturers who were not going to get contracts renewed. He was one of the ones waiting for a renewal. I let him talk. We both grumbled about this, but eventually we moved into trying to think about solutions. What else might he do if he didn't get a contract? He'd been teaching at this institution for 12 years. I'd been there for 24. We had a comfortable life. We knew our students, we knew our colleagues, we knew how to teach our classes. We had great friends and a strong community. But one of us, and now I can't remember who, raised the question, could we go somewhere else? I think we both rolled the idea around for a bit, couldn't really talk about it right then. I don't completely remember, but I know that when I was sitting in the next faculty meeting, listening to more dire news about budgets, listening to administration, it was not super supportive of different departments, sitting in another meeting where I could pretty much anticipate what different colleagues might be going to say around the table. And I decided to reach out to a colleague who was more of a mentor for me on the way out of that meeting. And I asked if maybe he would go to lunch. He was a colleague and a bit of a mentor, someone who'd made the move to my department later in his career. And he said, sure, let's have lunch next week. So I found myself at the local lunch spot on Main Street, asking him about how someone who was later in their career might consider or go about finding a different faculty position. He was full of helpful advice and reminded me to just get started by having conversations. Well, there it was, the start of those conversations with friends, with colleagues in the field. What if? And in those conversations and the follow-up ones we had with our family as we went along, a crazy idea started to take root. We could move somewhere else. We could be at a different school. The more we talked, the more excited we got to be at a place that offered new adventures and possibilities, teaching different groups of students. It was the start of a new adventure that wound up with us moving our family, including several high school aged children, hundreds of miles from where we'd been to a new state, New Jersey, which, by the way, is where my life started and where I swore I'd never live again, and me moving to a position at Rutgers in the School of Social Work. I think more than a few people wondered about our sanity, but it was really an amazing opportunity for a new adventure, to be in a different sandbox. And I think it's interesting to think about what this turning point says about me. I think it said to me that I wasn't as afraid of change as maybe I thought I was, that I was game for trying something new. I think it's also, as I moved into the turning point, about being in a space that opened me up to really looking at a lot of things differently and being open to some new ideas, new challenges, and new opportunities. So that's the narrative that I wrote in the 20 minutes that we spent, and then we talked about it. And I'll just say a few things in terms of what it was like to, and what I learned about myself by having the opportunity to do that. Is, I think, as Sherry said, that our narrative group was really a safe space. I think Zoom helped in some ways, that we had a little bit of the closeness and distance at the same time. It certainly allowed for me to connect with colleagues around the country to come together to talk about this, which, yes, we have close relationships with our colleagues who are next door and in our departments, but sometimes it's helpful to talk about professional development with people who are a little bit farther away. Maybe safer to talk about career changes and things like that than with the people that we work with most immediately. It helped me focus on strengths and opportunities, and was a combination of personal reflection and group process. And really, for me, writing this story, I had already done that turning point. So I already moved to New Jersey. I've been here for 2 years. And yet writing and talking about it also opened up some new ways of thinking about it. It helped me really get more clarity about a really big professional decision that I'd made, and that I was glad that I made, but to think about it in some new ways. In reflecting on the story and what it says about me as a professional, as well as being inspired by the comments and the other stories that I heard from my colleagues, it also helped promote confidence to continue to take risks and continue to try new things, and so it's also allowed me to jump into some smaller but nonetheless significant turning points in my current position and my current job, and really continue to feed that. So was a very helpful and meaningful experience.
Thank you, Vicki. It was nice to hear that story again. So now we're going to turn to Dr. Clementine Msengi, who is going to tell a high point story. Her story is entitled "The Influence of Mentoring on Professional Growth and Resilience," and she wrote her story in response to this prompt. Please describe an episode or moment in your professional life that stands out as an especially positive experience. This could be the best moment of your professional life, or another especially happy or exciting moment. Try to think of something experiential, not just getting an email with an acceptance of some kind. What kinds of professional activities do you enjoy most? Describe this moment in detail. What happened, when and where, who was involved, and what were you thinking and feeling? Also, describe why you think this story was so good and what it says about who you are as a professional. Clementine?
Thanks, Dr. Harvey. I had a lot of high points, but as I reflected on this question, I decided to reflect on mentoring. So I'm going to read what I wrote. I've been involved in higher education for a long time. In addition to my personal sense of commitment and diligent work ethic, I have found mentoring to be an important component in my professional growth and resilience building process in higher education. New faculty in higher education may face challenges that can impede their success. Such challenges include balancing responsibilities between research, teaching, and service. Today, I'm grateful for the excellent mentors who have shared their time to freely guide, support, and show me unique ways of accomplishing new tasks as I navigated my way in higher education. Having good mentors in my professional life have not only increased my confidence, but has also inspired me to pay it forward by mentoring others. I have had the privilege of mentoring other faculty members, both formally and informally. In addition, working with my students, I have enjoyed giving them my time freely in order to listen to their needs, provide them with genuine feedback, offer guidance, coach, and support them when they needed me. I'm more than glad to offer those tools, maps, and wisdom I have learned along the way. I cherish the opportunity to mentor students and lead them through their doctoral dissertation journeys. Each time a student successfully defends his or her dissertation, it brings me joy to see their smiles and witness their pride as they walk across the stage to receive their diplomas. Having great mentors and mentoring others is one of my high points in my professional career. That's what I wrote on high point. And when you were thinking about what to present in this conference, that quickly came like my number one, because I truly believe having mentors can make a difference in helping people succeed professionally, even building resilience in their career.
Okay, thank you, Clementine. And so now we have Danielle Littman. She wrote on a current challenge, and the title of her story is "The Work is Never Done," and she responded to this prompt. Please identify and describe what you consider to be a current professional challenge. What is the challenge or problem? How did it develop? How are you, or how do you plan to deal with this challenge? What do you think will be hard about dealing with it, and what will be helpful? How does this challenge relate to your overall sense of purpose in your work? Are there risks or opportunities? Danielle?
Thank you. Thank you so much. And thank you all for being here. So this is "The Work is Never Done." I must admit that I'm already annoyed by what I'm about to write. I already know what the textbook solutions are. If I were a friend coming to me, I would know the right advice to give. And even with all of that knowledge, I am still struggling. I am struggling with how to find a pace of working that will work for me in the long term. A pace that allows for enough generativity. Notice I did not use the word productivity. I'm trying to challenge the use of the word, so mired in capitalist narratives. Enough generativity to have a foothold in the academy, but not so much or too soon that I break. I have my notebook right here. It's the first year of my life that I feel like I'm in my career. I have had many jobs, but I've never wanted to move up in any of them before. In academia, in some potentially perverse way, I really do feel like I've found my place. It feels good. It feels terrifying. But I'm one of those people that has the tendency to work until I'm completely exhausted. And if the work isn't done, it's near impossible to shut my brain off. And of course, in academia, the work is never done. There are always more papers to write, conferences to apply to, funding to find. The work is never done. I imagine you're listening to this and thinking, wow, she really needs to figure out balance. And I do, I know I do. But how do you actually do that in a context and discipline that says fully otherwise, in a society that says otherwise, and when you look around you? And those who are highly generative or in positions you'd like to hold someday have worked so much. I'm struggling to find a pace that is mine, that will allow my nervous system to settle momentarily, existentially. I keep telling myself, once I finish qualifying exams, once I finish coursework, once I finish comps, once I finish my PhD, once I get a job, but it goes on, right? There is no arriving at calm, arriving at settled. It is something I need to create for myself. And then when I shared that with the larger group, I ended with the line, "Your wisdom is welcome." And so that sort of tumbled into a conversation with people who, in my group at least, were in really varied places in their careers. There were people who were a couple of years into assistant professor jobs. There was another person who was sort of just making their way into academia. There were people like Sherry who had been deep in their careers and who are the sort of people that I'm looking up to and saying, like, how do I do this? And one of the people in my group said, I think any of us could have written that. I think any of us could have expressed some version of that same thing. And so in that moment, I felt extremely seen, which is something that I think Sherry acknowledged already as one of the goals of this group. But I also got some concrete ideas from other people, as well as some recognitions that people are all finding their own ways to deal with this same tension, with the same struggle. And from a personal, emotional standpoint, it just felt really good to hear that from others in my group, and especially people who I was looking around and saying, I want to be in a role like you. I want to be in a role like you. And so that felt really good to experience. And I would say the other thing that I really valued about sharing this story and sharing other stories as well is that I come from a creative writing background. My undergrad was in theater and creative writing. And so I really process things by writing them out, and just sharing my feelings verbally is not usually the way that I am best able to process what I'm dealing with. And so this was an opportunity to use a process that I already love, creative writing, and just writing in general. And that was a really wonderful vehicle to get my thoughts across. And that is something that worked really well for me, and I imagine would probably work for others who also process through writing as well. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Danielle. And so I am going to read my story from the Not So Positive Behavior prompt. And the title of my story is The Day I Vouched for the Wrong Person. And the prompt that I responded to was this: although we try, most of us have also done things that we are not completely proud of. Tell a story of a time you made a mistake or misjudgment in a professional context. What happened, where and when, who was involved, and what were you thinking and feeling? How did you cope with this and deal with the ramifications? Try to approach this with some perspective. We all err. Focus on what you learned or can learn. A few years ago, I met a colleague A in a few advisory panels and conferences. We got along well and seemed to share a similar perspective on many of the issues facing the field. This colleague had a lot of community connections. So when a call for grants came up that addressed our joint area of interest, we talked about partnering, even though we had never written anything together or worked on a research project. The call was on child victimization, so I reached out to D&H, two of my long-term collaborators, who I knew were interested in more grant funding and also in building relationships at this funding agency. D&H and I have worked together a lot. Neither one of them knew A. So I vouched for my newer colleague A to D&H, and that turned out to be a mistake in my judgment. We had some calls. D&H and I had some texts that could be used in the grant, and so we ended up contributing a lot to the proposal. We all went in for some significant amount on the budget. For me, it would have been about $80,000 of my time over 3 years. Partly because of our expertise and grant writing skill, we got the grant, but it started to fall apart almost immediately. My new colleague A was the PI, the principal investigator, and quickly became rather authoritarian and also started trying to renegotiate the budget we had submitted even before we had the final award papers, to the benefit of her organization, of course. After some difficult and fruitless conversations, D.H. and I all ended up withdrawing from the project, which meant a lot of uncredited and uncompensated work. Even worse, much worse to me, it meant that contrary to building relationships with that funding agency, we became a problem child to them. I apologize. It was the worst of a few occasions when I have learned the hard way that serving on committees or having fun at a conference dinner are very different from working together on a grant. Now, if people express interest in that, I usually suggest we write a paper first. I've been surprised by how many people don't want to do that, but I've also learned that some people want the funding more than the work. I mean, I want the funding too, mind you, but it takes more than simpatico political views to make a good research collaborator. And now I try to be more patient about letting those relationships develop. So what I would say about this story is that I don't think that we share enough about learning from our mistakes, or even that in the professional context, there's kind of this pressure to admit that, you know, yeah, I went 25 whole years and I never made a single mistake, and because I'm a professional, you know, and I chose to read this story because I think that these are harder stories for many of the people compared to high points or turning points or really even low points because of the role of your own agency in the mistake. But I did want to note that surprisingly, they're not the hardest story, and that both in the groups that I've run and over these interviews, I've often found that there's a lot more resistance, that the most resistance comes to the positive behavior story because people are often uncomfortable saying something good about themselves. And then I just also wanted to make a couple of comments because it's been a learning process for me about facilitating these stories. And so, for example, for this week on not so positive behaviors, I found that it can be helpful, you know, as it says in the prompt, I built it into the prompt that say that everyone makes mistakes and that this is an opportunity to reflect on how to handle it when they make a mistake. I think it can be helpful to tell people that the goal is not for them to beat themselves up and that they don't have to worry that there's going to be like some aha moment and the rest of the group is going to be like, we knew you were an imposter, you know, and that this is, you know, that we should be able to talk about this stuff without there being some sort of, you know, real interpersonal threat to it. And for people who are, I mean, I actually chose one as I think you could probably tell from the story that happened several years ago. And in general, I do think that that's easier for perspective taking, and that if you want to try to be able to reflect more on your coping and on what you've learned from it, then maybe it's better for something you have a little more distance from in terms of time, so there's not quite as much emotional oomph. But I guess the last thing I wanted to say before we switch to the next part of our panel, which is some planned questions, is that one of the things that I learned from listening to everybody else's stories about their mistakes is that their mistakes were often being driven by the things that I appreciated and loved most about some of my colleagues, and that this came up over and over as a point of conversation. And you know, that was actually like a really profound thing for me to realize. And so even on this one, which I still do feel bad about because it really caused a lot of trouble for my colleagues, D and H, and it was, you know, I was pretty much the one that got them into that frying pan. And so, but, you know, I also realized from sharing it, which I had not done probably outside of kind of processing it with D and H themselves, with talking about it with other people, that one of the reasons that I got into that situation is because of some of the things that I value, that I value making new professional relationships. And in fact, that's why I made this group that we're talking about, and which was a good thing. And then I value, you know, trying to connect with community partners, even though I know that working outside of the ivory tower, you know, brings its own challenges. And so, you know, so even though sometimes the things that you value might also trip you up or get you into challenging situations, I think it's, you know, is still kind of affirming to me to realize like, well, you know, that did turn out badly, but at least I was being driven by things that are consistent with my values, which I don't think is something I fully realized before. So with that, we are fond of a format where there's a little more room for discussion and not just presentation. So before we turn to the comments and questions that are coming in from the panelists, we want to take the last 12 minutes or so of our formal presentation time and cover some questions or discussion that we've already drafted for each other. And so the first question that we came up with is for Clementine and Danielle. So how has this changed the way you think about professional development or mentoring? Clementine, would you like to go first?
Sure, yes. For me, participating in this group, when I first started, I didn't even know what to expect. I thought, well, maybe I'm gonna learn how to, you know, write and improve my writing skills and all these things. But I actually end up getting so much more from this, just learning from everyone, hearing their feedback, and observing how you, Dr. Handy and Dr. Banyard, facilitated this event. That alone was a learning experience for me, and just hearing feedback. So to me, that was more than just writing. So it was, the whole experience was great.
Yeah, I definitely agree with a lot of those things. And I would also add to that. So I, as you can tell from my story, am very new in the field of social work specifically, which is my field, and in academia. And so I think that for me, I have been feeling out and understanding what my professional mentorship relationships look like in my own context, which I've been really fortunate that they've been very generative and fruitful, and I do feel like I can be myself with my mentors. But sharing personal writing across the Zoom void with people who I didn't already know, and even I didn't necessarily know were like as connected to my field as I realized they were at first. Like because I got connected with Resilience Con just this past year, and I knew that Sherry was in psychology, I was like, okay, so I am like maybe not gonna be meeting other people who are also in social work. And then I realized much of my group was in social work as well. And so that was really an exciting thing. And I had like a moment of like, oh, maybe I shouldn't be this vulnerable with other people who, might have power at some point over me, or like people who I'll meet at these conferences. And then just accepting, like, okay, I'm just going to be my full self here and see what happens. And I think that that was a choice that I feel really good about, and one that I think we don't do enough of. As Sherry was talking about, there are a lot of these formal ways that we have to connect, such as formal mentorship relationships. But now I feel like when I meet, hopefully in the future, various members of my group in person, we will feel as though we've connected on a deeper level, and that there can be that professional piece to it, but also this deeply personal piece. So I feel a lot of gratitude for that. And I think that it helped break down for me just the idea of what mentorship can look like, and also what networking can look like too.
Okay, terrific. Our next question is for Danielle and Vicki. How does sharing in a narrative format, the writing and the reading, foster a particular type of connection or disclosure? Vicki, would you like to take this one? Danielle just spoke first.
Yeah, I can. Yeah, so I think the writing and reading, first of all, the writing part gives you time to collect your thoughts and reflect. I thought the writing also kind of encourages kind of for yourself first to freely explore ideas, kind of like when we tell our students to free write before we ask them to be part of class discussion, right? Just kind of collect your thoughts. I feel like the prompt was really just about writing and not censoring your writing or making it linear or trying to make it, to just write. And so it's kind of writing to think. And Danielle, when you talked about kind of coming from that tradition, like I don't write. So this was a very different kind of writing for me. I know some people journal and that kind of thing, but that's not usually what I spend time doing. I just write journal articles. So this was very freeing. Really kind of the writing opens your mind to things, and you sort of start on this descriptive level. And then as you share it with colleagues, you get a chance to really talk through the story and kind of see yourself through their eyes and kind of see it in some different ways. And so it was kind of a really cool combination of this tangible writing in the present in your space with a notebook and a pen yourself, and then being in this virtual connected space with colleagues all over the country having a conversation about it. There was something about that that just was really so meaningful.
Yeah, I do think I spoke to this already a little bit, but I really valued the process of, yes, getting to collect my thoughts, and for me finding the right words for things. And I recognize that's maybe an unfair binary, but I really enjoy collecting my thoughts to capture them in the best way that I can. And then I think that reading verbatim what I had written felt almost like it allowed for more vulnerability to emerge, because you're not like just sharing your thoughts, you're sharing a recounting of your thoughts. And I think that that mediated distance can allow for a little bit more vulnerability, especially across Zoom and across new relationships.
Yeah, I like the comment about the reading. I think that is it's kind of a surprising outcome of that piece. The next question is, how can this help build new academic cultures that genuinely respect and appreciate difference and diversity, whether differences are of class, gender, sexual orientation, race, nationality, age, ability status, language, or religious belief? Vicki?
Yeah, so in thinking about this, I think that the nature of this kind of professional development writing was, as my colleagues have said, was very personal. And so I think it really, for somebody like me who's been entrenched in this sort of academic culture and ways of writing and expectations and constraints for lots of years, it really allowed for more creativity and voice. And I think part of the potential of that kind of writing is that it really puts everybody in a different place, right? It kind of moves you all to a space that's not the usual academic hierarchies, mentoring to someone else, giving advice to someone else. It kind of puts you all in the same space where you're doing something professionally that's really different. It reminded me actually of another experience. I seem to have these a lot with Sherry, which is where she put a bunch of us in to do those Ignite 20 by 20 kind of presentations back a number of years ago before they were the big thing. And to have a room full of academics who've been used to being like, they were at the top of their game of doing these polished PowerPoint presentations. And all of a sudden, all of us needed to do a very different kind of presentation. And it was like the most fun session because we were all so much more spontaneous and trying to figure it all out, right? And so I think it creates and opens up spaces for people to have different kinds of conversations and to be more vulnerable as people to one another, which I think welcomes in connections between folks who may not usually encounter each other or encounter each other in these very hierarchical and constrained cultural scripted spaces in the academy, like faculty meetings, right? Which don't really allow for that. And, you know, I mean, it really made me think about, you know, when we go to professional development, we usually think about the conferences that we go to, and those are really siloed, right? Like, even if I'm going to the American Psychological Association, well, first of all, that's psychologists, right? But then I'm going to all the violence talks. So I'm just talking to the same people that I usually talk to, and I'm not really encountering either including professionals outside the academy, right? I think it just allows for a space that gets us to talk to new colleagues at different points in their career, and in a place that is allows for that kind of vulnerability to really be able to make those connections. And it just made me think, I'll just close with a story from my students. So I was teaching last fall, and I was teaching a group of students, and I had non-traditional students and traditional age students and students coming up from community colleges and students that had been in just a real mix of students. And we were really talking about what makes a safe learning space, a place where learning can be uncomfortable and challenging, but nonetheless safe. And one of my students said to me, well, what's really important to me is that I understand and get to know the person of the professor. And those more personal stories are really important. And I think, as my colleagues have said, all too often there is not a lot of space for that. And I think creating those spaces helps support the voices and the connections that we need to support diversity and to be hearing different voices in the academy.
Yeah, and then I'll just quickly respond to this question too. I wanted to just mention two things. First, that in terms of you know, making sure that there was some diversity in it, is that we're intentional about the invite. So first, I did reach out to a number of people that I have mentoring relationships with who are at various different professional levels around the country, and that was a diverse group before I opened it up to, you know, then I sent it to my listserv, which is how I connected with people like Clementine and Danielle I got to know by reaching out to a larger audience. And then I think the second thing, I mean, something I really think that problem with sort of supporting people from diverse, have more inclusivity at all levels of the pipeline, is that we don't share a lot of the conventions and kind of insight information that you really need to succeed, whether it's at applying for jobs or writing articles or grants. And that this was really a way, I think, to share some of that information about how we've survived different professional challenges at different levels of our careers. That was really powerful for people. If I could just have one more minute, I have one question I wanted to ask Clementine, Pam, before we turn to the others. So this one is for you, Clementine. What surprised you about the group experience?
Thanks, Jay. For me, I was surprised how quickly I actually felt comfortable. You created this safe space. For me, it takes me a long time to share and leave it on sharing with people you never met before. The first 2 sessions, I was like, let me listen to what they say. Maybe I can kind of shape it around what they say. But by the end of the whole thing, I was sharing all these things. I'm like, what happened? I don't know what happened. So just creating that space where we felt comfortable to share and develop that trust. To me, that was great. After we finished, I feel I can pick a call and call any of you and feel like we've known each other for a long time. And we haven't even seen one another before. So that was great for me. And also how much I learned by listening to each one of the stories that were shared. So that self-awareness, to me, didn't come just from my writing, from everybody's participation. The whole group experience shaped the experiences in the ways I didn't expect. So thank you for organizing that.
This is really amazing. And let me give you the compliment that's come in here, that there's one comment that says, I train health coaches and you've inspired me to create this kind of process for our graduates. So I think anytime you can see an example and you can get people's personal experiences in something, it helps people visualize opportunities and potentials. So it's really, really inspiring. I have sort of organized some questions for you that have come in 3 different ways. And one is, people are very curious about the sort of practical aspects. How big were the groups? How often did you meet? Did you mix it up? Was it the same people all the time? And then in sort of an extension of that, how important is it they were professional focused? In other words, was there an element of trust already established because you were coming together for professional development?
Yeah, those are all great questions. So in terms of just some of the practical ones, one of the groups had 6 people in it and one of the groups had 8. I think that's probably the range that would work the best. The 8-person group went over the 90 minutes we'd originally planned every single solitary time. And actually one of the questions that Clementine asked for me is, if I knew at the beginning of this project what I know now, what would I have done differently? And and I think I was a little hesitant to ask for like a 2-hour block of time, because I thought nobody's going to sign up for that. And but maybe I think it would be better to have like a longer block of time. I mean, even at 2 hours, a lot of times people were just sort of, reluctantly leaving that kind of space of connection and stuff. But yeah, that's what I would say in terms of group size. And then it's, just like for any kind of focus group or psychotherapy group, I think like the same sort of size works. But I have done a version of it. You mentioned the issue of doing it more. I've done group in a more clinical setting without the professional focus, and the original interviews didn't have a professional focus. And then just a couple of weeks ago, actually, after ours all ended, I did this group with a bunch of professional colleagues, and the people who were organizing that asked me to just focus more generally on stories of resilience. And that was a very different group, even though it was also kind of similarly, the people in it were the same. I mean, mostly people who were in academia in some capacity or another. But I think that the professional spaces of it really is just something that we don't get enough chance to talk about. And so those other stories are important to share too, but I really felt that there was a lot of benefit from getting people to focus on, I mean, a lot in those other groups, I mean, people talk about, you know, they talk about the birth of their children for high points, or the loss of a loved one for low points. And those are important experiences. But they're also probably stories that people already have places to share and process with each other. And so I think what was really unique about this group is that even for myself, there were a lot of stories that I had never really shared or talked about before, that I had just kind of struggled with on my own. And you know, so I mean, I have some of those other high points and low points, you know, like the birth of my own children or the loss of, you know, my own loved ones. But those are experiences that I already have people I can talk to about.
That's really helpful. How long did over what period of time did the groups go on?
We met once a week, and originally we were only going to do 7 weeks because there are 7 prompts, but then both groups wanted to have like an 8-week just kind of chance to say goodbye and, you know, and share a few more moments together. And then we have been trying to think about ways to reconnect down the line, or what to do about that. So we're still trying to brainstorm about what that might look like.
Awesome. So one of the questions that came in is referring to narrative constructivism and talking about how narratives can be used to rewrite people's perspective and rewrite their identities and how they think about themselves. In the context of the pandemic, did you see story shifting, or did people feel like they were able to rewrite their stories or retell their stories in ways that were positive or productive because of this experience?
Does someone else want to take a stab at that question?
So I'll start with some ideas about it. I think it's a really good point. I think that I'll speak for myself, that I felt like, I think that idea is something that question has actually given me an idea, Sherry, about your point about how our group is trying to, I think each of the groups are trying to get together again and have some ongoing contact. And I feel like that kind of prompt, that might end up being actually a prompt that we might want to do, which is to kind of reflect on where the pandemic has put us and where a lot of the social movement shifting and things that are happening in current events, how that's intersecting with our professional development. That I think that's actually a really great idea about something that we may want to do next, right? I think that originally, kind of when I signed on, right, it was more creating a space within the pandemic to create connection, but we were all still so in it, right? This was like April and May. So things were still unfolding. We were trying to finish up our online teaching. And so I think there was almost a concerted, like, we're not talking about now and how the pandemic's affecting us. Like, we're just using this as a connection space to think more broadly. But I do think that as we move through into some more spaces, we may have that perspective to kind of add that in. I don't know what if you all would agree with me.
Yeah, I would definitely agree with that. I don't think that the topics of our stories tended to center around the pandemic, but I do think that I was in a place of like heightened vulnerability or heightened reflexivity, probably just because of this moment of feeling unsure about things. And so I think that having some space for constructing narratives can help ground ourselves potentially in those spaces of uncertainty and vulnerability. And I would also say, just in terms of the constructing narratives piece, there were several times, and folks in my group did this after hearing my stories, as well as I kind of challenged other people, that we would share something and this is especially for like the low points or for, you know, professional, not so positive behaviors, things like that. People would respond and say, wow, I I really see that situation differently, or have you thought about thinking about things in this way, and not in an invalidating way, just in an, I have witnessed your experience now through your eyes, and I wonder if you thought about it from this perspective. And I found that to be a really interesting experience, because a lot of times, as Sherry said, these are stories we've been sort of holding on to and maybe didn't have a place to share. And so being witnessed as well as slightly challenged to say, well, have you thought about it in this way? I think there was some reconstructing in my own mind and experience that happened when others would do that.
That's a really great point. So can you guys, you've spoken a little bit about the role, obviously this technology enabled this experiment. The benefits or challenges of technology, what did you gain from the mediated experience, or the distance, or the community that could come together? Or I'll come up with another question.
I think it was Danielle who a little earlier said that there was something about, or maybe it was Vicky, sorry, I'm not quite sure, that it is a strange sort of, even in the moment that we're having right now, there's this kind of strange intimacy and then this strange, distance at the same time. And so I do think that it is a very new sort of interpersonal experience, very, very Star Trekky, that we're all, like on these monitors somehow. But for the most part, as we were talking before, as we were all getting ready for the panel to start, it has been kind of a revelation to me that there's this new way of interacting that I hadn't really experienced before. And some of the people in the group that I did know before, are people I've only usually get to see, because we typically go to this, X conference, and so we're there for 2 or 3 days, and that can be a pretty intense kind of experience. But it was really lovely to be able to interact with them on a more regular basis and learn so much more about them. So for the most part, I think even once we're all able to gather in person again, that Zoom may still be the best way to have something like this, because it makes the time feasible for people who are at a distance from each other.
Yeah, I wonder also if it gives you a little bit of space for safety and interpersonal connection. You're sort of both together and a little bit mediated, whether that encourages people to feel a little more comfortable sharing, or a little more, like, I can always hang up if this gets hard, that kind of thing.
Well, nobody did that.
Well, no, I know, but you have the off button, right?
Yeah,
so you have that safety net.
There is that sense of control. I don't know, what do you all think about that?
Yeah, I think for me, it's also just that you get to be in a group with colleagues who aren't the people you usually work with. Or if you do work with them regularly, like Sherry and I work together on projects regularly, but when we usually get together, it's to kind of talk about the project, right? You've got your list, your agenda that you have to get through. So, this was an opportunity to really talk with colleagues at institutions, who are all around the country. And in fact, in our group, we had participants who weren't even necessarily in traditional academic jobs. So there were some intersecting interests that brought them there. So I think it has that reach, which also kind of gives you that kind of one sense removed, right? Where sometimes it's easier to go and talk to somebody outside your immediate context to kind of process some of those professional development pieces.
Cool, thank you. So one question that came in is, how did you develop the prompts? Where did those come from? Were those tested and tried, or were they, is that your sort of first draft? How did you come up with them? And I guess maybe a follow-on is, did you find some more effective than others?
The prompts, so several years ago now, I guess back in like 2012 and 2013, Vicki and I started a project with a couple of other colleagues, and it had a qualitative piece where we were planning on doing interviews in the region where my research is based, which is based in Tennessee in a sort of rural southern Appalachian region. And we brought this consultant in originally who wanted us to ask everybody to organize their lives into the chapters of a book. And I just really thought that was a terrible idea. And, you know, I mean, especially in a community where, I mean, it's just a very academic idea, you know, where books are like this important metaphor for other things. And that's just not true in much of the rest of the world. And plus, I just thought how hard how hard it would be, and then maybe also like how that would just end up being like, well, I was born here and then I went to school there, and then this year I got married, and this year I had my first child. And you know, it doesn't really get to the kind of stuff that we were hoping to get. And so it took quite a lot of negotiation, as I'm sure Vicki remembers as well. But we eventually ended up on this approach that was more like key scenes of your life. And as I said, there are other people who work in narrative and work in qualitative interview methodologies who use similar types of approaches. We didn't invent that by any means. And so for this group, what I did is I took those questions, which I had previously used in both group and individual interviews, and then I adapted them for professional settings. And, you know, I think that they, you know, and then it is organized in a very intentional way. So for example, just like I was taught many years ago to organize a therapy interaction, I mean, it starts with something, or I would organize a survey like a little safer and easier to talk about. So high points are the first story that you do, and then it kind of ends on something looking ahead towards the future, so that you don't kind of end on having talked about just low points or not so positive behaviors or some of the harder stories. So, you know, we've done it with, as I said, more than 200 interviews and multiple group experiences. And I've tried a lot of other different interview approaches that just never seem to come close to this one in terms of getting people to really, you know, just to have that sense of feeling seen and really sharing things that are important and meaningful. So, you know, I am pretty happy with how that worked. And the professional aspect of it, I just kind of made that up for the purposes of these groups. And I guess in terms of the one that I think if I were going to try to keep tweaking it, maybe it would be the sort of next chapter or the final story one. I don't know what you all would think. I mean, I'd actually be curious to hear from you all, like what stories you thought were most powerful, or what might be changed or added.
Danielle, Vicki, Clementine, anybody got what stories they would add, or what was you thought was the most personally impactful or caused you to experience the most, I don't know, growth, development, insight?
I would say the high point and the low point, they allow you to sort of drop into a moment. And I think that felt easier to write, or easier to sort of access. I agree, Sherry. I think that the next chapter felt, and maybe it's where I'm at in my life, that I'm like, I don't know, like I can write a list of goals or dreams or hopes. And it was harder for me to have narrative ways of thinking about that, because it still felt really amorphous. And maybe that's interesting, and maybe that's the point, but it evokes a different kind of thinking.
For me, I thought every prompt was really good. I end up missing the 8th session. I think I was traveling, I had some technical issues, but I would have loved to see a session on the whole reflection of the whole experience from everyone. So if I was to add something, I would probably add that just to hear, or maybe it was discussed in the last session that I made. I thought it was great.
So are you saying, Clementine, I mean, what you're saying sounds really interesting, that to use the last session to almost tell a story of the experience?
Right, like the way we're doing that, but in that.
Right.
State. Yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah, it's a good idea.
Yeah, I think that would be a good idea, because I think, and Clementine, I think you've brought this up a couple times today, but it's such a good point, which is reflecting on what I learned from other people, right? So the writing prompts helped me learn from myself, and we had some discussion, and it was very helpful to hear colleagues' reflections and to have those audible narratives, right, as you say, Sherry. But I think it would be really interesting, Clementine, to reflect on, because I learned so much from our group. Like, I learned so much from the stories that my colleagues told of their experiences. And I think it would be really neat to write about that and kind of consolidate those reflections a little more. I like that idea a lot.
So for people who are really interested in what you've done and want to find out more about the protocol or the experience, I presume you're writing this up, or they can find you on your websites, or how would someone who is inspired by what they've heard today move forward?
Yeah, you can certainly, somebody asked that question. Let's see that question. You can certainly find me on our information about LifePaths on our website. It's lifepathsresearch.org, or if you just Google my name, it should take you to it pretty quickly. You can also find my email there if you want to contact me about it. We are hoping to have some more groups in the future, as well as find some ways for the ones that we've already had to reconnect. So hopefully in the fall. And I just saw a question come in about, was this approved as faculty development? It wasn't. And one of the things that I said, which, I guess that would be interesting to think about, but I think one of the things I said on the very first day is that, of course, in addition to just addressing issues of confidentiality and group process and that sort of other kind of like first group material, is that I did say, that it wasn't continuing education, that it wasn't research, that it wasn't therapy, and that it wasn't something that we were really documenting or keeping track of attendance or anything like that. And which that doesn't mean I wouldn't be willing to consider doing it as professional development, but I do think there was something freeing about the experience when it just wasn't getting like measured or counted or evaluated in some way. And so I would have to think about whether what it would mean to give that up in some way when you were trying to get some kind of continuing education credit or something like that. And then I see a question that's come in about joining a group. If you want to join a group, probably the easiest way to keep up to date with stuff like that would be to join ResCom, our listserv, where we announce things like that. So you can send an email that just says subscribe ResCom. It stands for Resilience Community, so it's RESCOMM. And then if you send that email to LifePaths, LIFEPATHS, at lifepathsresearch.org, then you will get added to that, and that's where we announce these things. But you can also send me an email directly, and I'm happy to add you to a list of people who are interested. My easiest email is probably just sherry.hanby, which you can see I've spelled my name on the screen, at gmail.com.
That's very helpful. Thank you. So let me just ask one more. Any final thoughts anyone wants to share on what this experience has been like. I was thinking of your group rather than this one today, but I open to both before we close and move to the break.
Just a lot of gratitude, I would say. I think that talking today has like lifted up that same sense of gratitude that I felt throughout the whole process. So ending on a note of gratitude on my
And gratitude, as we know, is a big contributor to resilience. So well done there. I want to thank you all so much for taking the time, Zooming in. It makes all the difference to be able to have people from so many different places come together. You know, one of the things that you've shown here, I think, is how important these kinds of collaborative spaces are. Even later, even once we can get back together again, because there's some unique properties to this kind of connection, whether that means that it's asynchronous or whether the people can be from around the world, or you can squeeze it in between your two faculty meetings, or whatever it is that you're trying to do, that it provides a very nice additional way of connecting rather than a replacement way of connecting. So I think that this has been a wonderful example of something that can become more regular rather than less. So thank you, and thank you for sharing the personal stories. That's a meaningful contribution, so I appreciate that very much. So everyone out in the audience knows there's going to be a break until 11:15. There are two panels that will start at 11:15 in room 1. The panelists are going to introduce the new APA journal, Technology, Mind, and Behavior. That's a nice forum for media psychology, in addition to some of the other journals that exist. And then in room 2, 4 authors of the upcoming Fielding Graduate University monograph called Real Characters are going to discuss their research on parasocial relationships. So if if we have no more questions or comments, then I'll say thank you and have a wonderful day.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so
Thank you.
much.
Thank you.